The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond my office windows, sunlight bouncing off the glass towers like gold coins tossed into the air. From here, on the 32nd floor, the world always seemed quieter, like the noise of the streets below couldn't quite reach me. I took a slow sip of my vanilla latte, the rich warmth seeping into me, and adjusted the cuff of my silk blouse. The soft rustle of fabric against my skin was one of those little luxuries I'd promised myself I'd never take for granted again. That's when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. Richard Hayes. I hadn't heard that name in 6 years. My old boss. The man who once told me, in front of an entire boardroom, that my work was too inexperienced to be taken seriously. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Almost. Instead, I answered, my voice smooth and even. "This is Claire Morgan." His tone was polite, maybe even a little too polite. "Claire, I didn't realize you were the CEO of Morgan Strategies. We have a situation. Your firm comes highly recommended." Highly recommended. I bit back a smile. If only he knew the irony. As he explained the problem, my eyes wandered to the signed multi-million-dollar contract on my desk, the one from his biggest competitor. My mind was already turning, weighing my options. This was going to be interesting. 6 years earlier, I wasn't the woman in the silk blouse. I was the junior analyst sitting in the far corner of a long, cold conference room, trying not to let my nerves show. It had taken me 3 weeks to compile that market report. Late nights in the office, half-eaten takeout containers stacked by my desk, the glow of spreadsheets burning my eyes. I'd triple-checked every figure, every projection. And I knew, deep down, it could save the company from making a disastrous expansion into an unstable market. But when I slid the report across the polished mahogany table toward Richard Hayes, he didn't even open it. "Claire," he said with that condescending smile I'd come to dread, "we value your enthusiasm, but this is above your pay grade." Heat rose in my face. "Sir, if you could just review the numbers." He waved a dismissive hand. "We've got this. Don't waste your energy on things you don't fully understand." The board members chuckled politely. My fingers dug into the armrest of my chair to keep them from trembling. I forced myself to sit up straighter, but inside, something cracked. That night, I went home to my tiny apartment, still clutching my leather-bound notebook, the one my mother had given me when I graduated. Inside the front cover, she'd written in her looping handwriting, "Write your own story, even if no one reads it yet." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I made my decision. The next morning, I walked into Richard's office with my resignation letter. He barely looked up. "Where are you going?" he asked flatly. "I'm going to build something that matters," I said, surprising even myself with the steadiness in my voice. His smirk told me he didn't believe me. Well, good luck with that. I walked out of the building with nothing but a second-hand laptop, a few savings, and that notebook in my bag. My stomach was in knots, but my mind was strangely clear. I didn't know how I was going to do it, only that I would. The first year was brutal. I set up my office on the kitchen counter of my one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. My desk was just enough space for my laptop, a notepad, and a chipped coffee mug that read "World's Best Daughter." I'd work until 2 a.m., researching markets, building proposals, sending cold emails to companies that would never reply. Most days, it felt like I was shouting into a void. But then, one Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Marian Brooks, a woman I'd met at a networking event months earlier. She ran a mid-sized tech startup in Seattle and needed market analysis fast. "I remember how you spoke about strategy," she said. "You sounded like someone who sees the whole board, not just the next move. Can you help us?" That first project paid just enough to cover rent and groceries, but it did something more important. It lit the first spark. Marian introduced me to another founder, who introduced me to another. Slowly, my client list grew. I started working out of coffee shops, then rented a desk in a co-working space. My office became a corner near a window, where I'd watch the city moving below while I built pitch decks late into the night. There were setbacks, of course, contracts that fell through, months where the numbers barely balanced. But every small win pushed me forward. My first client who renewed for a second contract. The moment I hired an assistant, Jenna, to help manage emails. Signing my first five-figure deal. Still, I kept my success quiet. Old colleagues from Richard's company probably assumed I was scraping by as a freelancer. My social media was deliberately understated, just the occasional coffee shop photo or vague, excited about new opportunities post. The truth was, I liked it that way. I didn't want validation from the people who once doubted me. I wanted the freedom to grow without their shadows looming over me. By my fourth year, Morgan Strategies had clients in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. We specialized in market risk analysis, the same skill Richard once told me I didn't fully understand. I'd invested in a small but elegant office in Midtown. Frosted glass doors with my company's name etched in silver. Shelves lined with market reports and business books. A corner with fresh flowers that Jenna changed every Monday. And yet, even as the numbers grew and my team expanded, I never forgot those first nights at my kitchen counter. I never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed in that boardroom. It didn't drive me in a bitter way, but it did remind me why I'd built this life. What I didn't know was that fate was about to loop back around, bringing me face to face with the man who once tossed my work aside. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but I arrived early. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted a few moments alone in the conference room my firm had reserved at the Four Seasons. The room was bathed in soft morning light, the kind that made the marble table gleam. Fresh white orchids stood in tall glass vases at each end. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, a view that seemed to silence people the moment they stepped inside. At precisely 9:58, the door opened. Richard Hayes walked in, flanked by two executives from his company. Time had added a few lines to his face, but the confident, dismissive posture was exactly the same. For a second, I thought he might not recognize me. Then his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Claire," he said, as if the name had been pulled from somewhere far back in his memory. I smiled politely, extending my hand. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming." He hesitated before shaking it. "I didn't realize," his voice trailed off as he glanced toward the discreet nameplate at the center of the table. "Morgan Strategies, Claire Morgan, CEO." I gestured for them to sit. "Shall we get started?" For the next 20 minutes, I let them explain their problem, a projected market crash in one of their international divisions, eerily similar to the scenario I'd outlined in my report years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. When they finished, I leaned back, resting my hands lightly on the table. "My team can fix this," I said. "But there are conditions." Richard's brow furrowed. "Conditions?" "Yes. First, I have full autonomy over the project. No interference, no second-guessing. Second, my team will have direct access to all relevant data without delay. Third, I paused, letting the silence stretch. You will acknowledge my expertise to your board. Publicly. One of the executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard's jaw tightened. "That's unusual." I met his gaze steadily. "So, is this situation?" There was a long pause. He looked like he wanted to push back, but the truth was plain in his eyes. They needed me. And they needed me now. "Fine," he said finally. "What's your rate?" I slid the proposal across the table. It listed a consulting fee nearly triple what I'd earned in an entire year under his employment. He scanned a number, then looked up at me, disbelief flickering across his face. "This is substantial." "It's standard for the results we deliver," I replied, keeping my tone even. "And, Richard, you're paying for more than analysis. You're paying for someone who sees the whole board, not just the next move." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the city far below filled the silence. Finally, he nodded. "We'll sign." I closed the folder and stood, extending my hand again. "Pleasure doing business with you." This time, he shook it without hesitation. But the look in his eyes was different, less arrogance, more calculation. Maybe even respect. As they left the room, Jenna slipped in, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. "So," she said, "how did it go?" I allowed myself the smallest smile. Exactly the way I planned. Outside the window, the park was alive with movement. Joggers, cyclists, a couple walking their dog. The city hadn't changed, but I had. The girl who once sat silent in the corner of a boardroom was gone. In her place stood a woman who negotiated on her own terms. And Richard Hayes now worked for me. The contract was signed that afternoon. But for me, it wasn't just about securing the project, it was about setting the tone for how this partnership would work. 2 days later, I stood in Richard's boardroom, the same room where, years earlier, he tossed my report aside. The long mahogany table was still there, the leather chairs unchanged, but this time, I wasn't seated at the far end. I was at the head. The executives filed in, some of them familiar faces. A few did double takes when they saw me, their whispers barely concealed. Richard cleared his throat. As you all know, we've brought in Morgan Strategies to manage this situation. Claire Morgan will be leading the initiative. I didn't let him continue. And before we start, I said, my voice steady but warm, I want to be clear about the conditions of my involvement. I saw the flicker of surprise around the table. Consultants don't usually open like this, but I wasn't here to play by the usual rules. First, I said, every member of this team will work collaboratively and transparently. No withholding information, no power games. My gaze shifted deliberately to one executive who'd been known for both. Second, decisions will be made based on data, not ego. If my analysis says we pivot, no politics. I let my eyes land on Richard for a beat longer than necessary. Third, and perhaps most important, this isn't just about salvaging your bottom line. It's about changing how you operate. Toxic patterns, dismissiveness, arrogance, resistance to new voices are part of what brought you here. They end now. There was a ripple of shifting chairs. A few people avoided eye contact. Others I noticed looked hopeful. Richard gave a short nod. Understood. I softened my tone slightly. Look, I'm not here to humiliate anyone. But I built my company on the principle that every voice at the table matters. That's the culture my team lives by, and that's the culture we'll bring here. If you can't adapt, we won't be able to help you. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, one of the senior VPs spoke up. I think we're ready for that change. I smiled faintly. Good. Then, let's get to work. As I rolled out the plan, assigning tasks and setting timelines, I noticed something I hadn't expected, Richard actually listening. Not just waiting for his turn to speak, but truly listening. It was a small thing, but I knew it was the beginning of something bigger. For the first time, I wasn't the one adjusting to someone else's world. They were adjusting to mine. 6 months later, the numbers told the story better than I ever could. The division Richard had feared would collapse was now not only stable, but profitable. Inefficient projects were cut, smart expansions were launched, and a culture shift had begun to take root. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but the board had started to notice. At the final review meeting, Richard stood beside me and addressed the room. Morgan Strategies didn't just save this company millions. They taught us a new way to think. And for that, I want to thank Claire Morgan personally. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory kind I'd once heard in this building. It was genuine. Afterward, as the executives trickled out, Richard approached me. There was no arrogance in his tone now, just quiet sincerity. I should have listened to you all those years ago. I met his eyes. Maybe. But then I wouldn't have built what I have today. He gave a small nod, as if conceding the point. Later that night, back in my midtown office, the city glittered beneath me. Jenna had left a bouquet of white lilies on my desk with a card that simply read, "You did it." I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out my mother's leather-bound notebook. The pages were worn, the ink faded in places, but the words inside the front cover were as clear as ever. Write your own story, even if no one reads it yet. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the weight of every moment that had brought me here. The late nights, the rejections, the risks, the small wins, the silent victories no one else had seen. And I realized something. It wasn't about Richard. It wasn't even about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. I closed the notebook and set it on the desk beside the signed 3-year consulting contract. one worth more than my entire salary in those old corporate days. Leaning back in my chair, I let a smile curve at the corner of my lips. He once told me my report wasn't worth reading. I murmured softly, imagining the final voiceover line. Now, he signs checks to make sure I keep writing. The city kept moving outside my window, but for me, the moment was still complete. I had written my own story, and it was worth every word.